Greetings paddlers, Bill Dawes here from supboardguide.com. Today we're going to talk about how to paddle in a straight line. This is one of those things that a lot of paddlers have an issue with. Yes, for sure, when you're paddling it's always going to be a little bit of kind of S-ing as you're going along, going from side to side. But a lot of people find that they're having to change sides with their paddle all too often, and they're assuming that they're doing something wrong. So maybe they are, maybe they aren't. That's what we're going to talk about today. So first thing we want to do, let's just rule out any possible problems that might be causing this that aren't actually related to your paddling. Firstly, it's important to understand that if you're paddling straight into the wind, your board is always going to be wanting to turn more because the wind is trying to weathercock your board, it's trying to turn your board around downwind. So whatever board you're on, however good you are, when you're paddling into the wind, you're going to have to change sides more often. That's just a thing, okay? So don't stress about that. Another really important thing to understand is that if your board is short, if your board is wide, both those factors will make a board turn more. So if you're on a short, wide board, particularly, for example, a paddleboard that's designed primarily for surfing, then yes, again, this board is just built to turn and you will need to change sides more often. Okay, so that might be your problem right there. You haven't got a problem, you're just simply on a short, wide board trying to paddle into the wind and your board is going to be really turny. Maybe that's not the issue. Next thing, let's just check out a few other aspects of your equipment. This is particularly the case if your problem tends to be more on one side than the other. That could be for a couple of reasons. It could be because you have a natural body asymmetry, which many of us do, particularly if, for example, you're a racket sport player or a golfer, you might have a much stronger side of your body, and when you're paddling on that side, invariably you're putting in more power than the other. So you're ending up doing maybe 6 strokes on one side and 4 on the other, okay? That's natural. I encounter this all the time, body asymmetry. And yes, you could train through it, but to be honest, I would just say go with it. It's really not a major problem in the greater scheme of things. The next thing to check out before we actually get into investigating your paddle technique is just to make sure it's not something actually literally wrong with the board. I have encountered this on many occasions. Spent an hour on the water with a client trying to work out why they kept turning their board to the right, for example. And there didn't seem to be anything wrong with their paddling. It looked good. But then when we got ashore, I flicked the board over and their fin had about 40 degrees of twist in it. Okay, so that for sure was the problem. And I should have checked that first. So you do that too. If you've got a problem whereby your board seems to always be changing course one way, then just have a look at it. Make sure that the fin is straight. When you're looking at it from behind, it's not twisted or leaning to one side. Make sure your board itself doesn't have twist in it. This is actually surprisingly common, particularly with the lower cost inflatables. When you pick the board up, leave the nose on the ground and look down from the tail to the nose, you might see that your board has a degree of twist in it. In my 15 years of working with inflatable, I've encountered literally hundreds of boards that have some twist in it. So, could be things like that, okay? Your paddle. This is not uncommon also. When you look down your paddle, you might actually find that the handle of the paddle is not aligned with the blade. Again, that's going to cause a degree of twist in your paddling. So there's a bunch of things there that is probably quite important to rule out before we actually get into talking about your paddle stroke. The most common fundamental technique issue that paddlers make, which causes their board to turn too much, is actually really simple. If your paddle is at an angle instead of vertical when you're paddling, then effectively each stroke you take is a turning stroke. Okay. To explain this, let's just step back a bit. Every stroke you take is ultimately going to have some turn in it because you're not doing it directly on the center line of the board. For obvious reasons, you can't paddle on the center line of the board because you've got the board in the way. I guess you could design a board that's got a hole in it and you put the paddle in there and you kind of pull yourself along, but it would look weird and it would be weird. It wouldn't be a very efficient way of paddling. So we have to paddle at the side of the board. So inevitably, therefore, every stroke you take is going to be trying to turn the board a little bit, no matter how straight and true your stroke is. But the closer we can get that paddle to the center line of the board, the better the stroke is going to be. If you paddle out here, that's very much a turning stroke. The more vertical your paddle, the more true and straight your stroke is going to be. So this is the first thing to check. A real good way of doing this is just get a friend to video you. Paddle straight towards them, get them to film you on your camera, and just see how vertical your paddle shaft is. You will probably find that you think it's vertical, but actually it's not. It actually takes quite a lot to get it up and vertical. You really have to push this top hand across. That's one of the first things to check. The second thing to do, which again, very effective way of looking at this is to use a video, is actually just to make sure that your paddle is tracking straight and true. Don't follow the line of the board, because if you've got a curved board, then if you put the paddle up by the nose and follow the line of the board back, actually your paddle is effectively going through that path. You want to put your paddle in the water so that when you apply power to it, the paddle blade appears to move exactly parallel to your direction of motion. It needs to go straight, okay? If you're pulling at an angle, then that's a turning stroke. So make sure your paddle is tracking true and your shaft is quite vertical. This may mean that you need to put the paddle a little bit away from the front of the board before you pull it back. That's absolutely fine. The next thing to make sure of is that your paddle is actually fully engaged. An awful lot of beginner intermediate paddlers don't get their paddle blade fully into the water. So what actually tends to happen is they put the paddle in the water and the paddle kind of wiggles around a bit and often goes out to the side. That is going to introduce a lot of turn into the stroke. Again, not good. This isn't the video to get fully into the realms of improving your paddle technique. We have other videos on our channel which I'd urge you to check out if you really want to work on your technique. But it is important to understand that what you need to do when you're paddling is to be pulling yourself forward, not pushing yourself forward. If I just try and demonstrate this from the side, so many people make the mistake of pushing their board along by putting the paddle in not too far forward and then pushing. What we actually need to do for a good paddle stroke is put the paddle blade in nice and far forward and pull. So you're pulling the board forward. You will hear people say, pull yourself up to the paddle. I often find that's actually quite a hard thing to kind of get your head around what it actually means. But if you just literally think, I am pulling the board forward like that, rather than pushing the board forward, then this is where good paddle technique comes from. And this also will do an awful lot to stop you turning. When you paddle back here, you're very much in the realms of creating turn on the board. You're pushing the nose around, whereas when you're pulling yourself forward, there's a lot less natural turn in the stroke. Okay, now hopefully, if you work through all those tips, you're going to find that your board is paddling much straighter. One thing I forgot to mention at the start, but again, a really important point, just check you're standing in the right place on the board. If you're not standing where the handle is, if you're standing too far back, then again, the board is naturally going to pivot more around the tail. So hopefully those tips are going to help. I'm just going to finish with a couple of don'ts. First don't worry about J strokes or steering strokes, this sort of thing. An awful lot of people coming into paddling from a kayaking background automatically assume that they need to use some sort of stroke correction. In the world of kayaking, you use the J stroke to hold yourself on course. Yes, these are valid techniques for paddleboarding, but they greatly reduce your forward efficiency. They're good techniques to have, but you don't need them. Don't feel you need these in order to course correct, okay? What you should do is learn to paddle symmetrically, and then at a later date for sure, learn how to do turnings and steering strokes. But this is not how you solve this problem. If you're finding your board turns too much, then there's other things going on. Let's deal with those before you get into the realms of turning strokes. Finally, you will encounter on an awful lot of videos about how to paddle straight, people saying that actually you need to put weight on one side of the board or the other. This is actually not true. It's a fallacy. It doesn't make any significant difference. At your level of paddling, it's much more likely just to destabilize you. We're going to do another video on that subject specifically because it's a really interesting myth to unpack. But for now, just say don't worry about it. Most important, just to recap, make sure your gear is set up right. Understand that if you're paddling to strong wind, your board's going to turn anyway. Your board shape has a factor, but chances are you're simply not getting your paddle vertical enough, or the track your paddle is taking is not true and in line with the direction of your board. Okay, I hope you found that useful. Go out and try those tips and hopefully your paddling will be much straighter. If you're still having problems, feel free to leave a comment below. We'll do our best to get back to you and answer any questions. Please like the video, save it so that you can refer back to it in the future. Check out the other videos on our channel, and in the description below you'll find a link to our website that's got a whole bunch more useful tips and videos. So, until next time, happy paddling.